back to my channel. This week in English 750, topics in textual criticism, information, literacy, and revolution across the 14th century, we're going to return to some medieval texts that we've discussed before, which is the Golden Legends and Piers Plowman. In particular, I want to investigate some aspects of the portrayal of people in poverty within these texts, especially since they sometimes contradict, even though they're both based in the Bible and principles of Christianity. So, in one of my earlier videos this semester, I discussed the saints and the poverty within the Golden Legend, and how the majority of the saints seem to embody lives of poverty and material minimalism, believing that being poor was being closer to Christ. In fact, many of the saints wished that they were poorer than they actually were, so that they could indeed be closer to Christ, with some even giving away all their material possessions to the point that they were almost destitute. I'll also link my full video on poverty in the Golden Legend in the description if you want to check that out too. So, from the Golden Legend, it seems that the poorer you are, or the closer you are to complete poverty and destitution, then the closer you are to Christ, and therefore getting into heaven. Especially if you give away a lot of your possessions and do charitable acts for the poor. Then, when reading Piers Plowman, I noticed that Long Will, the dreamer and main character in the text, seems to agree with the sentiment of the saints, as he says, quote, "A man wiser than Solomon was bore witness and taught that perfect poverty was to have no possessions, and a life that God likes most. As Luke bears witness, if thou wilt be perfect, go and sell. And this means to men that move over this earth, whoever wishes to be wholly perfect has to give up all his possessions, or sell them, as the book says, and dispense his silver to beggars, who for God's love beg and bid their prayers." End quote. Therefore agreeing with and backing up completely the sentiment of many of the saints throughout their lives from the Golden Legend. Will even continues on by calling religious figures that don't adopt this level of poverty to be hypocrites and less likely to get into the kingdom of heaven, with statements such as, quote, if priests were wise, they would take no silver for masses or matins, nor take meat from usurers, nor either kirtle or coat, though the cold killed them, if they did their duty." End quote. This clearly goes along with the teachings from the saints in the Golden Legend too, since many of the religious figures that are worthy of being elevated to saints did exactly this. Will continues on even more to make his case with statements such as, quote, "And all the wise men that ever were, from what I can tell, praise poverty as the best life if patience accompany it, and both better and blesseder by many times than riches." End quote. Showing again how living in poverty is a holy life close to God that will result in someone getting into heaven. Also, Will even explicitly states that, quote, "Why I'm making much of this matter is mostly for the poor, for in their likeness our Lord has often let himself be seen." End quote. Even further strengthening this point by God being seen in the poor themselves. So, everything is good, right? The Christian teachings of the Golden Legend and Piers Plowman line up, right? No, wrong. Even though what Will thinks and states is exactly what helped elevate clergy to the level of a saint, the spiritual leaders in Piers Plowman tell Will that his take on this is wrong. Does that mean that the saints from the hagiographies were wrong too? In fact, one of the spiritual leaders states to Will, quote, "When you were sleeping just now, you would have acquired clergy's knowledge and conceived more through reason, for reason would have reviewed all that clergy revealed to you, but for your interference you have been forsaken. You would have been a philosopher if you had remained silent." End quote. In this case, I think the spiritual leaders are saying that Will's analysis on the poor being closer to God and how the clergy should get rid of their possessions to be closer to poverty and also Christ is not reasonable, since they say he should have listened to reason instead. Therefore, is this a place where two Christian-centric texts don't line up with their advice? Or is Langland trying to make a commentary on the unreasonable ways that saints and religious figures tried to emulate poverty even though they didn't have to be poor? Is he saying that there's a difference between actually being in poverty without a choice versus choosing to be poor? He certainly does make disparaging comments about the clergy and the friars throughout the text, so the latter is entirely possible, even though clergy is one of the spiritual leaders that is supposed to help Will on his journey to do well and obtain spirituality and going to heaven and minimizing his sin. However, the text might also be saying that the spiritual leader that is clergy is more of an emotionally based figure opposed to reasonable, since because Will had his outburst and didn't listen, quote, clergy will no longer care to keep company with you, end quote, meaning keep company with Will. And Will is rebuked by reason too, showing how he was out of line according to multiple of the entities he's encountered in this dreamland. However, we do have this dichotomy where clergy essentially pieces out because he's made too emotional that Will didn't quietly listen to him, and then we have reason, attempting to pragmatically and logically explain this by rebuking Will. Also, the unknown speaker is telling Will that he is at this point in a spiritual journey that he must listen and take in information silently, opposed to trying to formulate his own thoughts, with the comment of, quote, you would have been a philosopher if you had remained silent, end quote. This supports the narrative later in the text that educated and read men have an easier time getting into heaven than unlearned men, which is another time that the spiritual leaders, or at least clergy, imaginative, and reason, diminish the poor and unlearned, even though the Golden Legend taught how holy and close to Christ they were. For example, Will continues to claim that people who are poor are closer to Christ and therefore have an easier time getting into heaven, whereas imaginative creates this narrative that one must be a learned man to understand how to get into heaven, kind of gatekeeping, with comments such as, quote, therefore, do not belittle logic, law, nor its customs, nor contradict clerks. I counsel you forever. For as a man may not see who is missing his eyesight, no more can any clerk know unless he acquired it first in the books, end quote. And, quote, just so by literature unlearned man learned to reason, end quote. And even further with, quote, no more can a kind-witted man, unless clerks teach him, come for all his kind wit to Christendom and be saved. And that's the coffer of Christ's treasure, and clerks have the keys to unlock it when they like. And to unlearned people give mercy for misdeeds if men will request it humbly and wholeheartedly and ask for grace, end quote. Which takes power away from the poor of being able to achieve this themselves and subjecting them to the whims and control of the clergy and religious figures if they want to get into heaven. This is absolutely a way for the church to control the poor or the populace in general, with making unlearned people feel like they don't have the capabilities themselves. Of course, we know people in poverty might have less access to education, and creating this narrative that religious figures hold the keys to heaven and that unlearned men must ask for it. I'm not going to claim to be like a religious expert or anything, but I more thought it was about a person's personal relationship with God, opposed to being shepherded and led by clergy members. This really is just a way to manipulate people and keep power with the church and religious figures. Since this is so troublesome, it seems that Langland is purposely trying to point out how corrupt this situation really is. So, through Long Will, Langland himself is maybe trying to reinforce his views that the poor were closer to Christ to begin with, and the clergy are incorrectly trying to sway the narrative. Imaginative even continues with other harmful statements, such as, quote, therefore, I counsel all Christians not to condemn clergy, nor make light of clerks' training, no matter what the clerks are like themselves, end quote. What? What is that? No matter what the clerks are like themselves? So even if your clerk is horribly corrupt and a terrible person, we should just follow them because they have more book learning? Then, imaginative even continues with, quote, "Why I have told you all this? I took careful note how you contradicted clergy with crabbed words," end quote. So this is also setting up the precedent that you're not allowed to speak out against the church or express a different opinion. You essentially must stay in line. Therefore, this ultimately could be a commentary by Langland that in British medieval society, the poor and unlearned are treated unfairly by religious figures, the rich, and even maybe the aristocracy itself, whereas they should be treated, better since they could be closer to Christ according to texts like the Golden Legend. They're instead being manipulated and controlled by people that have more money and more formal education. Perhaps then the voice of Long Will, which is deemed unreasonable and against the clergy, is actually the voice coming through of William Langland, as he is advocating for the poor, unlearned, and working class against the elitism and control of the church. In that case, the text of Piers Plowman might ultimately agree with the Golden Legend to some degree, if we look beneath the surface to see Langland's opinions opposed to the apparent opinion of the spiritual leaders. As even the Golden Legend takes the opportunity to show the holiness of the poor and the corruption of the church at points too. Well, that's enough for today, I think. As always, thanks so much for tuning in, and I really appreciate you watching. Have a good day. Goodbye.